Dorothea's new attitude, new, more worldly and practically engaged attitude, comes out in a conversation with Will, where he's saying, the thing one most longs for may be surrounded with conditions that would be intolerable. And he says, the best I've had to live for is over for me. Listen to how Dorothea responds. Sorrow comes in so many ways. She looks at it the other way around. Sorrow, the varieties of sorrow. And 2 years ago, I had no notion of that. I was very fond of doing as I liked, but I've almost given it up. She ended, smiling playfully. It's an odd gesture, and it recalls Miss Cadwallader's warning about becoming a little crazy. She's playfully smiling while she's saying, I've given up happiness. But I think it's a saintly gesture, kind of saintly wisdom. In particular, her sensitivity to the varieties of sorrow. I think this indicates Dorothea's growing intelligence about worldly fate, paying attention to those differences, the varieties in disappointment, rather than just indifferently categorizing things in terms either of success or failure. And Dorothea here seems to correlate it with love. She says she's learned how not to despise women a little, principally through the miniature. Opens her eyes to the struggles of other people and how personal and singular, idiosyncratic each person's struggle is. And I think this is a really key point about democracy, that equality does not mean uniformity. To be compassionate with the suffering of others is to realize how diverse it is. That it can't be reduced to a single, perspective or, political agenda. See how she talks about the working people, the political outlook of working people? Remember how she described Dagley? His attitude basically is whatever is bad, and change will probably only make things worse. And that's funny, but I think that the way she describes it here explains why it makes sense. Just the basic idea that if you're poor, you're always going to lose. You're in the perspective of that's getting exploited, and that nobody is representing until now. And so this is about the problem of paying attention to people who have been systematically exploited. In the absence of any precise idea as to what railroads were, public opinion in Frick was against them. For the human mind in that grassy corner had not the proverbial tendency to admire the unknown, holding rather that it was like to be against the poor man. And that suspicion was the only wise attitude with regard to it. And it sounds very practical, and based on experience. The point is that the poor and marginalized are not represented by the system. So their coping strategy is not a uniform policy. They make do with the resources at hand. That's what I think Dorothy is getting sensitive to, the sense of the varieties of suffering. Those very specific ways in which her emotions get articulated by way of, these memories of Featherstone's funeral or St. Peter's. It's a very unique texture of suffering, and it expresses a lot of her identity, even though it is experiences that she didn't want to happen. Eliot talks about it here in terms of the weather. The men of Frick were less given to fanaticism than to a strong muscular suspicion, less inclined to believe that they were particularly cared for by heaven than to regard heaven itself as rather disposed to take them in, a disposition observable in the weather. What I take that to mean is heaven's not taking care of us. There's no providence for us. We're the ones that are left out by history. Yet heaven is disposed to take us in. We'll be saved when we die. That's meager hope, as meager as it gets. And it's a disposition observable in the weather. That's really moving. I mean, it's saying, like, I see my salvation on beautiful days. It's the meagerest kind of hope, but it's articulated in the here and now. It's about taking advantage of the resources at hand. The beautiful day, it gives me something to believe in. It may be the meagerest hope, but it's concrete for what it's worth. It's about this day, here, now, and that's something that money is not, you know. This is a concreteness that Miss Cadwallader characterizes as crazy, not calling things by the same names as everybody else does. I think that's a really pointed kind of description of ideological conformity that Dorothea rejects. I never called everything by the same name that other people did. Mrs. Cadwallader correlates that too with the weather. This craziness, playing tragedy queens and taking things sublimely, sitting alone in the library at Lowick, you fancy yourself ruling the weather. When Eliot represents the political views of the peasants, like Dagley, she represents it as emphatically uninformed. In representing the perspective of marginalized groups, this applies to women too, their point of entry into the political discussion depends on acknowledgement of this systematic exploitation, that it always has worked out for the worst for the poor and women, and because they didn't have a say. And so if they're going to have a say, this systemic exclusion, silencing, has to be acknowledged in order for people to acknowledge who they even are, where they're coming from. This final paragraph that I've highlighted here is pretty interesting in the way Eliot correlates this argument about the poor and what it means to represent the poor, how it relates to the environment. The ruin of the countryside by railroads was discussed not only by the weights and scales, but in the hayfields. So not just by those engineers and surveyors, but the workers, where the muster of working hands gave opportunity for talks such as were rarely had through the rural year. It's as if the sound of political talk in this ecology of the rural year is a new ecological event, a new environmental event. So, as with Dagley, it's not about understanding reform. When Dagley harangues Mr. Brooke, that he's able to talk in a new way to new effects. I think that's what Eliot's saying here. Opportunities to talk that are new in the rural year. It's new activity. It's not about the ideas or the, policy. It's not that the suffering or the disappointment or social status as exploited has changed, but a new way of experiencing that, maybe a new power, a new, again, that sort of shaping activity is getting mobilized with this new talk. So after the locals attack the surveyors, they're addressed by Caleb Garth, and it's really interesting. Garth, who had represented this working man's integrity. That's why Mr. Brooke originally fired him, remember? But in this situation, Caleb is defending the railroad in kind of dogmatic terms that I think we're meant to question as readers. So this is another really subtle, complex situation, because it's like Dagley. It's not like these guys, Timothy and Hiram, are not confused. They seem quite confused, but they do have a kind of kernel of truth about the systemic inequality that Caleb here seems too blithely to excuse. And it's especially telling, I think, that Caleb makes recourse to the same metaphor of weather as Eliot earlier, I think, so movingly associated with the plight of the poor who have no other resource than sort of faith in the weather. So when Caleb here compares the railroad to the sun, the railroad may do a bit of harm here and there to this and to that, and so does the sun in heaven, but the railway is a good thing. That seems cheap slogan that doesn't share the working man's actual view of the weather. It does seem to give credence to Timothy's perspective. This is a big folks world, this is, but you're for the big folks, Muster Garth. Another example of Eliot really complicating our picture. As heroic and wonderful as he's seemed throughout the story, could it also be that he's kind of on the side of big business? I mean, he's getting aligned with it in his new job. He may not be wrong about the foolishness of attacking the surveyors, but he doesn't recognize legitimate motivation behind that attack. And it seems like Eliot points that out. Caleb was in a difficulty known to any person attempting in dark times and unassisted by miracle to reason with rustics who are in possession of an undeniable truth which they know through a hard process of feeling, and can let it fall like a giant's club on your neatly carved argument for a social benefit which they do not feel. He's not on the side of feeling, he's on the side of a neatly carved argument. Isn't that interesting? For Eliot, that's a litmus test, and Caleb's kind of blanket apology, big business, the railroad is like the sun, seems complacent in ways that are, troublingly reminiscent of Brooke. Pretty fascinating, and I really admire the complexity of the picture that Eliot's drawing here. The problem that Caleb is glossing over, she refers to the Channel, what they called a submarine railway between France and Britain. She says that sounds hard. Maybe that'll have its difficulties, but not as many difficulties as people present. Society making, imposing the railroad on society is a much bigger challenge even than building it underwater. The submarine railway may have its difficulties, but the bed of the sea is not divided among various landed proprietors with claims for damages, not only measurable but sentimental. So this sentimental concern, I think, is the feeling that Timothy and Hiram represent. It's so interesting again that Caleb fails to respond to it, since he is otherwise such a big representative feeling. I've got that feeling within me, Caleb says, that I can't keep working for Bulstrode. Those who held the most decided views about the railway were women and landholders. So this is really interesting to think about. Women, both old and young, regarded traveling by steam as presumptuous and dangerous, and argued against it by saying that nothing should induce them to get into a railway carriage. It's really interesting. Why? Well, social mobility poses a lot of particular risks for women. When families stay in one place, that incentivizes men to, take care of their children. But whereas, when there's more social mobility, I think there's more abandoned mothers. So that's another way in which important reason to be skeptical about the railroad, which Caleb has such faith in as a inevitable good. So why are the landholders against the railroad? Proprietors, differing from each other in their arguments, were yet and unanimous in the opinion that in selling land, whether to the enemy of mankind or to a company obliged to purchase, these pernicious agencies must be made to pay a very high price to landowners for permission to injure mankind. This is the objection for the sake of driving up the price. So this is another example of what it means for marginalized perspectives to be silenced. If we look at the landowners and women and farmers as all on the same side, they're all resisting the railroad, crucial differences in historical perspectives are glossed over. So it's really intriguing that although, as I was just saying, Caleb takes a strong moral stance out of his intuitive feeling and renounces his business association with Bulstrode. But when we look at Bulstrode's backstory, there's arguably foreshadowing of this selling out behavior by Caleb, which Bulstrode talks about in terms of instrumentality, making yourself an instrument. Bulstrode sees himself as an instrument, a tool of the church, but then when business opportunities come along, he is seduced into seeing himself likewise as an instrument of business. And that clearly represents losing his moral anchor, his moral compass. This instrumentality is without moral direction. Eliot is suggesting the same about Caleb insofar as he's on the side of finely crafted argument against the side of fellow feeling. That's where your moral compass comes from, according to Eliot, remember? The quality and breadth of emotion. If you're relying on reason for your moral direction, you're adrift, according to Eliot. Everybody can argue themselves into anything. That is demonstrated over and over in Middlemarch. So referring to his ministry as a young man, this was the happiest time of his life. That was the spot he would have chosen now to awaken and find the rest a dream. Isn't that interesting? He wishes he could undo his life choices, even though he just seems to double down and moral compromises he's willing to make and keep, making things worse and worse. He believed without effort in the peculiar work of grace within him and in the signs that God intended him for special instrumentality. Then came the moment of transition. It was with the sense of promotion he had when he, an orphan educated at a commercial charity school, was invited to a fine villa belonging to Mr. Dunkirk. This was the setting in of a new current for his ambition, directing his prospects of instrumentality towards the uniting of distinguished religious gifts with successful business. Super crucial comment of the narrators in relation to Bulstrode's endless rationalizations, and I think it applies to Caleb too. There's no general doctrine which is not capable of eating out our morality if unchecked by the deep-seated habit of direct fellow feeling with individual fellow men. Caleb's defense of the railroad seems like a matter of putting general doctrine ahead of fellow feeling. So Eliot suggests that the misgivings of the dispossessed, women and poor people, misgivings about the railroad, about progress, reform, are the result of experience. They may be superstitious, may be conspiratorial, but they are truths which they know through a hard process of feeling. Reality is not something that is dictated by rational argument. And there's a truth to the, hard process of feeling, truth to experience that Eliot suggests refutes rational argument, neatly carved argument for social benefits which are not felt. I think the point for Dorothea is she used to despise women, the fear of women, the passivity of women. What makes her smile playfully now is that she's overcome that and replaced that contempt with compassion. As she says in the very beginning about Celia, there's no yoked creature that doesn't have opinions of its own. So even to wear a yoke is to be silenced, censored from the historical record by kind of systemic necessity, yet they have opinions of their own. The truth that's censored out of the official objective history, it is necessarily discredited. As Casaubon explicitly said, he wanted Dorothea to obey his judgment, not use her own judgment about what to do. He wanted her life dictated by on his terms. So it's interesting here, this little gesture of writing him a letter posthumously, telling him that she couldn't finish his project. And the narrator calls it superstitious. So I guess what I'm suggesting here is this is Dorothea asserting her voice, putting her voice into the historical record, and if only in a token way. And so I think it's interesting. Eliot characterizes it first as superstitious, something to be smiled at condescendingly, not something to be taken seriously. But then says it should be considered all the more earnest. It should be considered especially serious, this gesture that she's making here. So that's an ambivalence in the narrator's characterization of what's going on here. The statement that Dorothea makes is actually quite revolutionary. She's not just, she came so close to making the pledge that she had made the pledge to herself, just not to him. So think about how far she's come since then. She's not only saying, I reject your request, I could not use it. I cannot submit my soul to yours. But moreover, above and beyond that, she's saying, your project, I didn't believe in it. And so I didn't believe in you, basically. It's not just that I'm not, submitting my soul to yours, but I don't believe in yours for your sake either. So that's not a little gesture. And the narrator proceeds, underscoring how big the stakes are. This silent colloquy was perhaps only the more earnest, because underneath and through it all, there was always the deep longing which had really determined her to come to Lowick. So that's even more devastating in a way. It's like, I wrote you this letter saying I reject your request. I don't believe in you anymore. But actually, that isn't even why I came here. I came because I thought, I might bump into Ladislaw. Eliot's such a sly narrator. Dorothea has become an active agent in the world. She realizes that what she cares about is not just the abstract ideal good, but good that is about making a difference in the world, making actual worldly choices and decisions and acting on them. But again, this isn't to say act on them rationally or practically in any kind of utilitarian way. It's like will to act on dreams and fairy tales. And the metaphor that Eliot draws here is probably the most fantastical yet. It's even a little frightening. She compares Ladislaw to this creature, four-legged creature with a human face. And she says, if some such creature came to you with a beseeching look, wouldn't you always want to see it again? So that it's like a strange, not even human connection. That, talk about queer, what is that? It can't be categorized as family bond or political bond or erotic bond. It's like interspecies bond. So Will wants to save her from the hissing dragons, and she is compared to a princess in the days of enchantment who'd seen a 4-footed creature from among those which live in herds come to her once and again with a human gaze. It's uncanny. It's a little bit disturbing. Which rested upon her with choice and beseeching. What would she think of in her journeying? What would she look for when the herds passed her? Surely for the gaze which had found her and which she would find again. So it's about getting recognized, not just as a human, not just as a woman, not just as any kind of normative category, but as this very singular creature, singular spirit in the cosmos that has had its gaze returned once. But Eliot concludes that's what life is about for all of us. Deceptively, perhaps, concludes this magical, disturbing, and very powerful analogy with a kind of an anodyne summary. Life would be no better than candlelight tinsel and daylight rubbish if our spirits were not touched by what has been, to issues of longing and constancy. This is what longing and constancy actually amount to, sort of feeling wedded to another creature of indeterminate species, mythological, magical, queer soulmate. And not accidentally, it's correlated with, perhaps mediated by Miss Noble, patron saint of Will Ladislaw. Dorothea was remembering what Lydgate had told her about Will Ladislaw and little Miss Noble, and she counted on Will's coming to Lowick to see the Fairbrother family. Dorothy has a sense of herself, of her own integrity, that is saintly insofar as she's willing to break with the norms of sanity in this world. Miss Cadwallader's, you'll certainly go mad in that house, my dear. You'll see visions. We've all got to exert ourselves a little to keep sane and call things by the same names other people call them by. Think about what a bore you might become yourself to your fellow creatures if you're always playing tragedy queen and taking things sublimely. It's almost like she intuits Dorothea's magical thinking, about Ladislaw as a four-footed creature with a human face. She's saying, you're going to be, alienated from your fellow creatures. It's like she's fighting for Dorothea's soul to stay human, to stay normal. But Dorothea's response is uncompromising. I never called everything by the same name that all the people about me did. Cadwallader has a kind of cutting reply. So I suppose you found out your mistake. Like, your marriage taught you better, right? And Dorothea, again, she feels the sting, but it did not hurt. That's so cool. And again, it sounds saintly. I still think that the greater part of the world is mistaken about many things. Surely one may be sane and yet think so, since the greater part of the world has often had to come around from its opinion.